The air in Judge Evelyn Carter's courtroom always carried a heavy weight, thick with the unspoken pain of children shuffled through the system. She had seen it all, the desperate pleas of parents fighting for custody, the exhausted sighs of social workers drowning in caseloads, and the tear-streaked faces of children caught in the crossfire. But today, something was different. Evelyn glanced down at the case file before her, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the thick folder labeled Daniel Myers, age 8. 7 failed foster placements. 7 homes that deemed him too difficult, too damaged, too much. The Turners, his most recent foster parents, sat stiffly in their seats, their expressions carefully composed but laced with irritation. The foster mother, Patricia Turner, shifted in her chair and let out a dramatic sigh as she folded her hands in her lap. Her husband, James Turner, adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit, glancing at his watch impatiently. At the front of the room, Daniel sat alone at the witness table, his small frame swallowed by the oversized chair. His head was down, his hands clutching something tightly in his lap. Evelyn couldn't see what it was, but the way he held it, fingers curled protectively, shoulders hunched forward, made it clear that it was important to him. "Mrs. Turner," Evelyn said, her voice steady and firm, "in your petition, you stated that Daniel has failed to integrate into your home. Could you elaborate?" Patricia cleared her throat and spoke in a tone that was both rehearsed and exasperated. "Your Honor, we have been foster parents for over a decade. We have taken in children from all backgrounds, abused, neglected, abandoned, and we have given them love, stability, and a chance at a better future. But Daniel," she paused for effect, shooting a sympathetic glance at her husband before continuing. "Daniel refuses to engage with us. He won't talk. He won't make eye contact. He doesn't participate in family activities. We've done everything we can, but he simply won't bond with us." Evelyn shifted her gaze to Daniel. He didn't react, didn't even lift his head. "Has he exhibited any concerning behaviors?" Evelyn asked. James Turner chimed in. "He has frequent night terrors. Screaming fits in the middle of the night. Last week, we found him hiding in his closet at 3 in the morning, clutching that photograph." He gestured toward Daniel's hands with a look of disdain. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "What photograph?" Patricia sighed, reaching into her purse and pulling out a crumpled image. She unfolded it carefully, as if reluctant to touch it. "This. It's the only thing he brought with him from his last placement. He won't let it go. If we try to take it, he has a meltdown." Evelyn took the photograph from Patricia's hand and studied it. The edges were frayed, the surface worn from being handled too many times. The image itself was faded, but she could still make out the figures, a young woman, heavily pregnant, sitting on a hospital bench. Something about it made Evelyn's breath hitch in her throat. "Your Honor," Patricia continued, breaking Evelyn's thoughts, "we have other foster children to consider. We simply cannot provide Daniel with the support he needs. We're requesting to relinquish our placement so that he can be reassigned." Evelyn's gaze flickered toward Daniel again. He still hadn't moved, still hadn't looked up. But his fingers tightened around the torn edge of another identical photograph, the same image Patricia had handed over. Evelyn set the photo down carefully. "Daniel," she said, her voice softer than before, "do you understand what's happening today?" For the first time since the hearing began, the boy shifted. He didn't speak, but his fingers trembled around the photograph. "Daniel, look at me," Evelyn urged gently. Slowly, he lifted his head. And when his dark eyes finally met hers, something inside Evelyn's chest twisted. Those eyes. A strange familiarity pulsed through her veins, something deep and unsettling, something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just recognition, it was something stronger, something she felt in her bones. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Daniel spoke for the first time since entering the courtroom. "You're my mom." The word sent a shockwave through the room. Evelyn felt the breath leave her lungs, her heart slamming against her ribs. The Turners exchanged bewildered looks, and a few murmurs rippled through the spectators. Patricia scoffed. "See what I mean, Your Honor? He's delusional. He makes up stories." Evelyn lifted a hand, silencing her. Her focus was solely on Daniel now. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice barely steady. Daniel sat up a little straighter, his small hands gripping the photograph like a lifeline. His voice was stronger this time, his gaze unwavering. "You're my mom." Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. This was absurd. Impossible. She had lost her son 8 years ago. She had held a death certificate in her hands, signed the paperwork, grieved for him, buried the idea of what could have been. But now, staring into Daniel's eyes, something inside her cracked open. A cold sweat prickled at the back of her neck as she fought to steady herself. Daniel, why do you think that? Daniel blinked slowly, as if surprised by the question. Then, he carefully unfolded the torn photograph in his lap and turned it around so she could see it. Evelyn's breath caught. It was her. A younger version of herself, sitting outside the hospital, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. The same photograph Patricia had given her moments ago. How did he have this? She could barely hear the Turners protesting, barely registered the murmurs in the courtroom. All she could do was stare at the boy in front of her, the boy who had been labeled too difficult, too withdrawn, too broken. The boy who might just be her son. Evelyn pushed back from her chair abruptly, standing so quickly that the courtroom fell silent. "We're taking a recess," she announced, her voice tight. "We'll reconvene in 1 hour." She turned sharply, her mind spinning, her body moving before she even processed what she was doing. As she stepped out of the courtroom and into the hallway, her hands shook violently. Because deep down, in a place she had buried for nearly a decade, she knew the truth. She had never stopped grieving. And now, she might just be staring at the proof that her son, the child she had been told was dead, was alive. And sitting in her courtroom. Judge Evelyn Carter walked into her chambers, closing the door behind her with a sharp click. She pressed her back against the heavy wood, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she tried to steady herself. Her mind raced, replaying the moment over and over, the way Daniel's dark eyes had locked onto hers, the quiet certainty in his voice when he had uttered those words. "You're my mom." It was absurd. Impossible. And yet, staring at him in that moment, she had felt something stir deep within her, something she had buried long ago. Evelyn forced herself to move, pacing to her desk where she kept a few personal belongings. She yanked open the bottom drawer and pulled out a small wooden box, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside were the remnants of a life that had never come to be, a hospital bracelet with a name she had never been allowed to use, a tiny knitted cap, and the death certificate. The document stared back at her, the ink as sharp as the day she had signed it. Infant Carter, stillborn. But if that were true, how had Daniel recognized her? A knock at her door snapped her out of her spiraling thoughts. "Come in," she called, forcing her voice to steady. The door opened, and Sarah Mitchell, the court-appointed social worker assigned to Daniel's case, stepped inside. Her brow was furrowed, her expression hesitant. "Judge Carter," she began carefully, "I wanted to check in on you." That was unexpected. Evelyn took a deep breath, gathering her composure. "Yes, it was." Sarah hesitated before stepping further into the office. "I know you keep your personal and professional life separate, but I could tell that moment shook you. Are you okay?" Evelyn met Sarah's gaze. The social worker had always been one of the few people in the system who genuinely cared, who fought tirelessly for the children in her cases. If there was anyone she could trust with her next question, it was her. "Sarah," Evelyn said carefully, "tell me everything you know about Daniel's history." Sarah's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she nodded, pulling out a manila folder from the stack in her arms. "Daniel entered the system as an infant. There's no birth certificate on file, just a note from the adoption agency that originally placed him, stating that his biological parents were unknown. He was placed with the Richardsons, but after about 2 years, they surrendered him back into foster care." Evelyn's stomach twisted. "Why?" Sarah sighed, flipping through the pages. "The report says they struggled to bond with him. Apparently, he had a lot of nightmares as a toddler, and they claimed he was emotionally distant. After them, he was placed with the Martins, who kept him for less than a year before citing behavioral issues. That pattern continued, each home shorter than the last." Evelyn pressed her fingers to her temple. "7 homes in 8 years, she murmured. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "And the Turners, well, they just made it official that they want out, too." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. The anger was beginning to build, slow and steady. 7 homes. 7 different families who had taken in a child and discarded him like he was defective. But beneath that anger was something deeper. If Daniel was truly her son, then his entire life had been built on a lie. Sarah shifted in her seat, watching her closely. Why do I get the feeling this is more than just another case to you? Evelyn hesitated. How much should she say? How much was too much? Finally, she reached into the drawer and pulled out the photograph, the same one Daniel had clutched in court. She handed it to Sarah without a word. Sarah studied it, her brow furrowing. This is you. Yes. Evelyn's voice was quiet. Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. You think? I don't know what to think, Evelyn admitted. But I do know that something about this doesn't add up. If Daniel were just confused, just looking for someone to cling to, then why does he have this picture? Why does he remember me? Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pulled out Daniel's case file again, flipping through the pages before pulling out another paper. This is the record of his initial placement from New Beginnings Adoption Agency, she said, laying it on the desk. Evelyn scanned the document, her breath catching at the date. 8 years ago. Right when she had given birth. The room felt too small all of a sudden. The walls were closing in. Sarah's voice was cautious. Judge Carter, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but if you really believe there's a chance that Daniel could be your son, then we need to investigate this. Evelyn nodded slowly. I need you to pull everything you can find on New Beginnings Adoption Agency. I don't care how deep you have to dig, I need answers. Sarah hesitated. Are you sure you want to do this? If you open this door, there's no turning back. Evelyn's jaw tightened. I lost my son 8 years ago. Or at least, I was told I did. But now there's a little boy sitting in my courtroom with my eyes, holding a picture of me, calling me his mother. So no, Sarah, I don't think I have a choice. Sarah nodded, her expression determined. I'll start making calls. Evelyn exhaled slowly. And Sarah? Yes. Keep this quiet for now. Sarah gave a short nod before turning and heading toward the door. Just as she reached it, she paused. If this is what we think it is, if Daniel is really your son, what will you do? Evelyn swallowed hard, 1,000 thoughts crashing through her mind. She had spent years burying the pain, convincing herself to move forward. She had built a life of control, of logic, of rigid structure. But none of that mattered now. Now, all that mattered was Daniel. I'll do whatever it takes to bring him home, she said. Sarah nodded once and left. Alone in her office, Evelyn sat back in her chair and stared at the photograph still lying on her desk. Her fingers traced the edges, worn from the grip of a little boy who had carried it with him for years. Somewhere along the way, he had never stopped searching for her. And now, she was going to do the same. The courtroom was eerily quiet the next morning. Judge Evelyn Carter sat behind the bench, but her mind was far from the legal matters in front of her. The gavel in her hand felt heavier than usual, the weight of unanswered questions pressing against her chest. The moment Daniel had uttered those words, "You're my mom," something had shifted inside her. She wasn't just a judge overseeing another child welfare case anymore. She was a woman seeking the truth about a son she had been told was dead. She glanced across the room, where Daniel sat next to Sarah Mitchell, his court-appointed social worker. He looked the same as he had the day before, small, quiet, gripping the photograph in his hands like a lifeline. His dark eyes flickered up to meet hers, and for the briefest moment, Evelyn thought she saw hope in them. She forced herself to look away before she lost her composure. Clearing her throat, she addressed the courtroom. This hearing is to determine the future placement of Daniel Evans, currently in the custody of James and Patricia Turner, who have formally requested to relinquish their guardianship. We will hear testimony from all parties before making a decision on Daniel's next steps. Patricia Turner sat stiffly beside her husband, perfectly put together as always, but there was a coldness to her demeanor. "Your Honor," she began, her voice laced with exasperation, "we've done everything in our power to provide Daniel with a stable home, but he refuses to integrate into our family. His silence, his emotional detachment," she sighed dramatically, "it's clear he's incapable of forming proper bonds." Evelyn's jaw clenched. "He's a child, Mrs. Turner, not a malfunctioning appliance." Patricia pursed her lips, clearly irritated. "With all due respect, Judge Carter, we have other foster children in our home who are thriving. Daniel's refusal to engage has created tension among them. He screams in his sleep, isolates himself, and refuses to participate in therapy." Evelyn turned her attention to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, do you have an update on Daniel's progress?" Sarah nodded, casting a gentle glance at the boy beside her before responding. Daniel has exhibited clear signs of trauma, including night terrors and selective mutism, which are not uncommon in children who have experienced instability. However, his behaviors do not indicate an inability to bond. They indicate that he hasn't been given a stable enough environment in which to feel safe forming those bonds. Evelyn turned to Daniel. "Daniel, do you want to stay with the Turners?" The boy shook his head slowly, clutching the photograph even tighter. "That settles it," Evelyn said, her tone firm. "Daniel will not be returning to the Turners." Patricia scoffed but didn't argue. Evelyn could tell she was relieved. The Turners had never wanted Daniel for Daniel, they had taken him in for the financial incentive, the extra monthly check. And now that he was too difficult, too broken for their liking, they were more than ready to pass him off to someone else. Evelyn sighed, her focus shifting back to the real issue. Where did Daniel truly belong? As the proceedings wrapped up, Evelyn made a decision. "I will arrange a private meeting with Daniel in my chambers before making any further determinations." With that, she brought the gavel down. Half an hour later, Evelyn sat across from Daniel in her office. Sarah stood by the door, ready to step in if needed, but she gave them space. Evelyn studied the boy in front of her. His small hands were still wrapped around the photograph, his posture defensive but not fearful. "Daniel," she said gently, "I need you to help me understand. How did you get that picture of me?" The boy hesitated, then slowly turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, were words written in careful cursive. "Your real mother. Don't forget." Evelyn's breath hitched. "Who gave this to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A lady," Daniel murmured, the first words he had spoken in front of her since the hearing. "Miss Jenny." Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. "Who is Miss Jenny?" Daniel looked down at his hands. "She was one of my foster moms. She said she used to work at the hospital where I was born. She told me, they took me away from you." The room spun. Evelyn pressed her hands against the desk, grounding herself. "How long did you live with her?" "Not long," Daniel admitted. "She gave me the picture and told me to always keep it safe. But then one day, new people came, and they took me away again. I never saw her after that." Evelyn turned to Sarah. "Find her." Sarah nodded immediately, already pulling out her phone. Evelyn turned back to Daniel. "Do you remember anything else about Miss Jenny? Maybe her last name?" Daniel frowned in thought before shaking his head. "I just remember she was nice. She smelled like flowers. And she told me," his voice trailed off, but Evelyn waited patiently. "She told me not to forget the lullaby." Evelyn's heart stopped. "A lullaby?" She swallowed hard. "What lullaby, Daniel?" His voice was barely a whisper when he began humming. And Evelyn knew that tune. She had sung it every night of her pregnancy, when she still believed she would hold her son in her arms. Her hand trembled as she reached for Daniel's, covering his small fingers with her own. "I believe you," she whispered. For the first time, his dark eyes shimmered with something new. Hope. Sarah found Miss Jenny that evening. Her real name was Jennifer Lawson, and she had once been a neonatal nurse at Riverside Memorial, the very hospital where Evelyn had given birth. But Miss Jenny wasn't in the state anymore. She had moved 5 years ago, after losing her nursing license under suspicious circumstances. Sarah tracked her to a small town in Oregon, where she had been working as a private caregiver. She agreed to talk, Sarah told Evelyn over the phone that night. But she doesn't trust authorities. She's scared, Judge Carter. She says she's been waiting for someone to ask these questions for 8 years. Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. "We're going to Oregon." Sarah hesitated. "Are you sure? This is bigger than just Daniel now. If what she says is true, then..." "I know what it means," Evelyn said. "It means my son was stolen from me. And it means I'm going to get him back." She turned to the small boy curled up on her couch, finally sleeping peacefully for the first time since she had met him. Evelyn had always been known for her relentless pursuit of justice. Now, she was about to take on the most important case of her life. Because this wasn't just about the law anymore. This was about a mother who had never stopped searching for her son. And a son who had never stopped searching for his mother. The flight to Oregon felt like the longest journey Evelyn Carter had ever taken. As the plane cruised through the sky, she kept glancing over at Daniel, who sat beside her, his small hands clutching the photograph like it was his most prized possession. In many ways, it was. Sarah Mitchell sat across the aisle, reviewing the case files they had pulled together. The Turners had been all too happy to sign away their rights to Daniel, and now, Evelyn had temporary custody. But there was no denying that this went far beyond a routine case of a displaced child. This was a conspiracy. The truth had been buried deep, but Evelyn knew in her gut that Miss Jenny held the key to unlocking it. Daniel yawned, curling into his seat. He had barely spoken during the trip, but when Evelyn reached for his hand, he didn't pull away. That was progress. She had spent the entire night before replaying his words over and over again in her head. She told me not to forget the lullaby. Daniel had hummed the tune with such certainty, with a quiet familiarity that shattered the walls she had built around her grief. There was no logical explanation for how he knew the song. It had never been recorded. Never been played outside the small, intimate space of her home. She had sung it to her unborn child. And somehow, he had remembered. When they landed in Oregon, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and fresh rain. It was a stark contrast from the suffocating atmosphere of the city, where cases like Daniel's were treated as statistics rather than tragedies. A rental car was waiting for them at the airport, and soon they were on their way to the small town where Miss Jenny had built her quiet life in exile. The house was modest, sitting on the outskirts of town, nestled between towering trees. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear. Evelyn pulled into the gravel driveway, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. She turned to Sarah, who gave her a reassuring nod. "You ready?" Evelyn exhaled sharply. "No." Sarah gave her a small, understanding smile. "Let's go anyway." She reached back for Daniel's hand, and this time, he let her hold it as they approached the house. Jennifer Lawson was waiting for them on the porch, rocking gently in an old wooden chair. Her silver hair was pulled into a loose braid, her face lined with age and something deeper, something Evelyn recognized as guilt. "Judge Carter." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her emotions. "I was wondering when you'd find me." Evelyn studied the woman carefully. "You knew who I was." Jennifer nodded. "The moment I saw your son." Daniel stiffened at the word. "His son." "Her son." Evelyn squeezed his hand. Jennifer's eyes softened as she looked at the boy. "Come inside. There's a lot I need to tell you." The inside of Jennifer's house was warm, filled with the scent of fresh bread and old books. It was clear that despite everything, she had tried to make a life for herself. Evelyn sat stiffly on the couch, her mind racing with possibilities. Jennifer took a seat across from her, folding her hands in her lap. "I worked at Riverside Memorial for 15 years, Jennifer began. It was a good hospital. Or at least, it used to be. But then, she sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. Then I started noticing things. Missing files. Newborns that were perfectly healthy suddenly listed as stillborn. And the worst part? Nobody questioned it." Evelyn's stomach twisted. Jennifer turned to Daniel, her expression gentle. "I was in the delivery room the night you were born. The air seemed to still. You were a fighter," Jennifer continued. "Came out kicking and screaming. And I remember thinking, this one is strong." Evelyn's throat tightened. But then, Jennifer hesitated, glancing at Evelyn with something like fear in her eyes. Then Dr. Harper came in. He was the one who made the call. Said the baby was gone before you ever had a chance to hold him. Evelyn felt the world tilt. "Dr. Harper was my OB." Jennifer nodded. "I know." She stood, walking over to a small cabinet. She pulled out a weathered envelope and handed it to Evelyn. Inside were copies of hospital records, some that Evelyn had seen before, others she had not. And then, she saw it. A transfer order. A newborn baby, listed as deceased, was signed over to New Beginnings Family Services. Her heart pounded. "They stole him." Jennifer nodded. "And they made you believe he was dead." Evelyn's hands trembled. This wasn't an accident. It was a black market baby trade. They targeted single mothers, Jennifer continued, her voice filled with quiet rage. Women who wouldn't have anyone to advocate for them. Who wouldn't ask too many questions. Evelyn's mind flashed back to those days, the confusion, the grief, the way the hospital had handled everything so quickly. She had been grieving. She had trusted them. "They took your son and placed him into a private adoption." Jennifer swallowed hard. "Only, the family that bought him, they didn't want him once they realized he wasn't the perfect, easy baby they had paid for." Evelyn glanced at Daniel, who stared at his hands. His small fingers traced the edges of the photograph as though it grounded him. "How did you find him again?" Jennifer exhaled. "I didn't. He found me." "What?" Jennifer turned to Daniel. "He was placed in my care when he was 4 years old. I recognized him immediately. I knew it was you." Evelyn's breath caught. "Then why didn't you tell me?" Jennifer's expression turned to one of regret. "Because the moment I did, they took him away." Silence filled the room. Sarah, who had been quietly absorbing everything, finally spoke. "Who is they?" Jennifer hesitated. "The people behind New Beginnings." Evelyn's stomach turned. "You don't understand," Jennifer continued. "This goes deeper than just one adoption agency. It's a network. Judges, lawyers, hospital administrators. They're all in on it. That's why I lost my job. That's why they discredited me." Sarah's face paled. Evelyn clenched her fists. "We have to expose them." Jennifer let out a humorless laugh. "I've been trying for years. Nobody would listen. But you?" She looked Evelyn dead in the eye. "You might be the only person who can." Evelyn glanced at Daniel. His dark eyes met hers, searching for something. Reassurance. Safety. A promise that she wasn't going to let them take him again. And she wouldn't. This wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about every stolen child. Every mother who had been lied to. Every family that had been torn apart by greed and corruption. She had spent her career delivering justice. Now, she was about to fight for something far more personal. She was going to bring the whole system crashing down. And she was going to make them pay. Evelyn Carter sat in stunned silence, Jennifer's words reverberating in her mind. "They stole your son. They made you believe he was dead." Her hands trembled as she clutched the hospital transfer order, the document that proved Daniel had been taken from her before she ever had a chance to hold him. Before she ever had a chance to know him. Daniel sat beside her on the worn couch, his small frame barely making an imprint on the cushion. He stared at his hands, avoiding eye contact. But Evelyn could see the tension in his little shoulders, the way his fingers curled slightly into his palms, as if bracing for the next piece of terrible news. Jennifer sat across from them, her own hands folded in her lap. "I know this is a lot to take in," she said gently. "But there's more." Evelyn swallowed hard. "More?" Jennifer exhaled, rubbing her temples. This wasn't an isolated incident. Daniel wasn't the only baby taken. Sarah, who had remained eerily quiet throughout the conversation, finally spoke up. "How many?" Jennifer's jaw clenched. "At least 30. That I know of." The room fell silent. Evelyn's grip on the transfer order tightened. 30 children. 30 families shattered. Just like hers. "They've been operating for nearly 2 decades, Jennifer continued. "Maybe longer. They take babies from mothers who are vulnerable, young women, single mothers, women with no strong family ties. They falsify death certificates and push quick cremation so no one asks too many questions. Then, they funnel the babies into private adoptions for wealthy families willing to pay." Evelyn's stomach churned. "How is this even possible?" Sarah demanded. "How has no one stopped them?" Jennifer let out a humorless laugh. "Because the people who should be stopping them are the same people profiting from it." Sarah ran a hand through her hair. "Judges, doctors, adoption agencies, they're all involved." Jennifer nodded. "And if you try to fight them? They'll destroy you. That's what they did to me. The moment I started asking questions, I was blacklisted from every hospital in the state. They made sure I couldn't work. I lost everything." Evelyn studied Jennifer's face. The lines around her eyes, the deep-set exhaustion. This was a woman who had sacrificed everything for the truth. She turned to Daniel, who was still eerily silent. His small hands clutched the photograph of Evelyn, the same one he had carried through every foster home. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "are you okay?" Daniel didn't look up. Instead, he whispered, "What if they take me again?" The fear in his voice sent a sharp pain through Evelyn's chest. She reached for his hand. "No one is taking you from me ever again." His grip on her fingers was tight, desperate. "They always do. Not this time." Evelyn's voice was firm. "We're going to stop them." Jennifer sighed. "It won't be easy." Evelyn's jaw set. "It doesn't have to be easy. It just has to be done." She turned to Sarah. "How much legal ground do we have with this?" Sarah frowned. The transfer order is damning, but it's not enough to take down the entire operation. We need more proof. More records. More witnesses. Jennifer nodded. I have names. Other mothers who lost their babies under suspicious circumstances. But they don't know what really happened. They think their babies died. Evelyn's chest tightened. Mothers who had spent years grieving children who were alive. She took a deep breath. Then we tell them. Sarah hesitated. If we do this, we're going to be painting a target on our backs. Evelyn met her gaze. Then let them come. I'm done being afraid. Jennifer looked between them, studying their faces. Then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, she said. I'll help you. But we have to be smart about this. She stood, moving toward a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. She retrieved a small metal box, placing it on the table between them. This, she said, is the evidence I've been collecting for the last 15 years. Evelyn's breath caught as Jennifer lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of documents, hospital records, financial statements, adoption paperwork. But the most damning piece of all? Photographs. Jennifer pulled out a series of old Polaroids. One by one, she spread them across the table. Each picture showed a newborn baby, swaddled in hospital blankets. Their tiny faces captured in grainy detail. These are the babies they took, Jennifer said. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she picked up one of the photographs. A baby boy. Tiny, perfect. His dark eyes stared up at the camera, as if searching for something. Or someone. She turned the picture over. On the back, in faded ink, was a date. The day her son was born. A shaky breath escaped her lips. This is him. Jennifer nodded. That's Daniel. Evelyn clutched the photo to her chest. She had nothing from the day he was born. No footprints. No hospital bracelet. No tiny handprints in blue ink. But now, she had this. And she would use it to burn them all to the ground. Sarah picked up another photo. Do we have names for the other babies? Jennifer nodded. Some of them. But the records are incomplete. We need to find the missing pieces. Evelyn looked at Sarah. How fast can we get an investigative team on this? Sarah exhaled. I can make some calls. But if we do this, we need to be careful. These people are powerful. They won't go down without a fight. Evelyn's gaze flickered to Daniel, who was watching her carefully. His dark eyes, her eyes, held a silent question. Would she fight for him? Would she make them pay for what they had done? She reached for his hand. Yes, she said softly. We're doing this. For Daniel. For every child they stole. Jennifer exhaled, relief flickering across her face. Then we start tonight. She reached for another file, flipping it open. If we want to take them down, we need to find the people at the top. The ones who orchestrated everything. Sarah peered over her shoulder. Do we have a name? Jennifer nodded. Dr. William Harper. Evelyn's blood ran cold. My OB. Jennifer's expression was grim. He was one of the ringleaders. Evelyn clenched her fists. He had been in the room the day her son was taken. And now, she knew the truth. She was coming for him. For all of them. And nothing in this world was going to stop her. Evelyn Carter stared at the name on the document. Dr. William Harper. The man who had delivered her son. The man who had looked her in the eye and told her that Daniel was dead. She could still remember the sterile smell of the hospital room, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, the numbness that overtook her as the nurse gently whispered condolences. We're so sorry for your loss. But it had been a lie. A carefully orchestrated deception meant to steal her child and erase him from her life. Evelyn clenched her fists. Not anymore. Jennifer tapped the file. Harper was one of the original doctors involved in the trafficking ring. He covered up stillbirths, handled falsified paperwork, and made sure newborns were transferred to adoptive families who had paid large sums of money. Sarah flipped through the documents. Do we know where he is now? Jennifer nodded. Still practicing. He moved hospitals a few years ago but stayed in the state. And he still works with private adoption agencies. Evelyn's stomach twisted. He was still doing this. He needs to be stopped, she said, her voice tight with anger. Sarah placed a calming hand on her arm. And he will be. But we need to be smart about it. Jennifer pulled out another set of papers. I have something else. The records of past cases. These files contain the names of at least 20 mothers who were told their babies had died. Some of them never questioned it. Some suspected something was wrong but had no proof. Evelyn picked up one of the names. Amanda Lewis. She turned to Sarah. "How fast can we track these women down?" "I'll start making calls tomorrow," Sarah said. "But if we reach out to too many people too fast, we'll tip them off. They'll destroy whatever evidence we don't have." Jennifer tapped the folder. "There's more. I still have contacts in the hospital, people who know what happened but were too afraid to come forward." "Do you think they'd be willing to talk?" Evelyn asked. Jennifer hesitated. "Maybe. If we can prove we're serious about exposing this." Sarah crossed her arms. "We need something concrete. Something undeniable." Evelyn's mind raced. "Proof. We need real proof." And then, an idea struck her. "What about the hospital's archives?" Jennifer frowned. "What do you mean?" "The old records. Patient files, birth records. If they falsified my paperwork, they did it to other women too. There has to be a pattern." Jennifer exhaled. "If the records still exist, they'll be in the hospital's restricted archives." Sarah nodded. "And those files are sealed. We'd need a subpoena to access them legally." Evelyn met her gaze. "What if we don't have time for legally?" Silence filled the room. Jennifer studied her. "Are you suggesting breaking in?" Evelyn didn't blink. "Yes." Sarah rubbed her forehead. "That's a felony." Jennifer shook her head. "Not necessarily. If I can get in contact with the right person, we might be able to get access from inside." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "Who?" Jennifer hesitated, then finally said, "A nurse named Lena Walsh. She worked at the hospital for over 20 years. She saw things, knew things. If anyone can help us get those files, it's her." Sarah sighed. "Can we trust her?" Jennifer nodded. "If we can find her." Evelyn stood. "Then let's do it. We don't wait. Every day we waste, more families are being torn apart." Jennifer grabbed her coat. "I'll see what I can do." Evelyn sat on the couch, flipping through the faded photographs Jennifer had given her. The one of Daniel as a baby. The same one he had carried with him for years. She traced her finger over his tiny face. Her baby. Her son. She felt movement beside her. Daniel had woken up. He stood in the doorway, clutching his blanket. "Mom?" Evelyn's heart swelled at the word. She opened her arms, and he climbed onto the couch beside her. She brushed his hair back. "Couldn't sleep?" He shook his head. "Bad dreams." Evelyn held him close. "I'm here. You're safe now." Daniel hesitated. "Do you think they'll come for me?" The question broke her heart. "No, sweetheart. No one is ever taking you away again." He leaned into her, his small frame relaxing against her. "Promise?" She kissed the top of his head. "Promise." Jennifer called early. "I found Lena." Evelyn and Sarah met Jennifer at a small diner on the outskirts of town. Lena Walsh sat in the booth, stirring her coffee with shaking hands. Her hair was streaked with gray, her eyes hollowed by years of fear. "You're the judge," she said, glancing at Evelyn. "The one from the case." Evelyn nodded. "And you're the nurse who knows the truth." Lena let out a ragged breath. "I kept my mouth shut for years. But I can't do it anymore." Jennifer leaned forward. "Lena, we need access to the hospital's archives." Lena's hands trembled. "That's dangerous." Evelyn's voice was firm. "Not as dangerous as letting this continue." Lena swallowed hard. "The files, they still exist. But they're buried deep. If you want to see them, we'll have to go in at night. Security won't be as tight." Evelyn exhaled. "Then we go tonight." Lena looked at her with something close to admiration. "You're not afraid, are you?" Evelyn shook her head. "Not anymore." That night, under the cover of darkness, Evelyn, Jennifer, and Lena slipped into the hospital's lower levels. Lena led them down a deserted hallway, past rows of locked doors. They stopped in front of a heavy steel door. "This is it," Lena whispered. "The records room." Jennifer pulled out a small tool set, working quickly to pick the lock. Evelyn's heart pounded as the lock clicked open. The door creaked as they stepped inside. Rows of metal filing cabinets lined the walls. Evelyn grabbed a flashlight, scanning the labels. Then she saw it. Infant mortality reports, 2015 to 2023. She yanked open the drawer. Inside were hundreds of files. Sarah's voice trembled. My God. Evelyn's hands shook as she pulled out the first file. It was a death certificate. For a baby that wasn't dead. Her stomach twisted. There were dozens more. Hundreds. Each one representing a stolen child. Jennifer gasped. We just found the proof we needed. Evelyn's jaw clenched. It's over. We're taking them down. Evelyn Carter's hands trembled as she flipped through the files. Page after page of stolen identities, falsified birth certificates, and fabricated death reports stared back at her. Each document was a monument to a mother's grief. Women like her, told their babies had died while their children were secretly taken and sold. Jennifer crouched beside her, rifling through another cabinet. These are hospital records from over a decade ago. The pattern is clear, newborns labeled as stillborn, then quietly transferred out of the hospital. Lena stood near the door, her face pale under the dim light. I knew it was bad. I just never realized how many families they destroyed. Sarah held up a file. Some of these babies ended up in foster care after their adoptive families backed out. Others were placed with paying parents, their origins erased. The ones who remembered, like Daniel, got shuffled between homes until they forgot who they were. Evelyn's grip tightened on the papers. How many more Daniels were out there? How many children had no idea they'd been stolen? Jennifer's voice was urgent. We need to get out of here before security makes their rounds. Evelyn nodded, stuffing as many files as she could into her bag. We'll make copies and get these to the authorities. Sarah whispered, and what if the authorities are part of it? A chilling silence filled the records room. They all knew the truth now. This wasn't just a handful of corrupt doctors. This was a system. And systems didn't crumble easily. Lena led the way down the dark hallway, pausing at every turn to listen for security. We have to move fast, she whispered. Night guards pass through here every 30 minutes. Evelyn held Daniel's stolen records close to her chest as they crept through the basement corridor. They were just a few feet from the exit when a flashlight beam swept across the hallway ahead of them. Security, Jennifer hissed. The four women pressed themselves against the cold wall, holding their breath as footsteps echoed closer. Evelyn's heart pounded in her ears. If they were caught, there would be questions. Who were they? What were they doing here? She had no doubt the hospital administration would spin a story, call them criminals, maybe even tamper with the very evidence they had risked everything to find. The guard stopped at the door to the records room. He jiggled the handle. It's locked again. Jennifer had made sure to relock it before they left, just in case. After a long pause, the guard exhaled and turned away. A minute later, his footsteps faded down the hall. Evelyn let out a shaky breath. Let's go. They hurried out the back exit, slipping into the night just as another guard rounded the corner. They didn't stop running until they reached Sarah's car. Jennifer threw the bag of files into the back seat. We did it. Evelyn's pulse was still racing, but her voice was steady. No. We just started. Back at Jennifer's apartment, they spread the files across the dining table, scanning them under the harsh glow of a desk lamp. Sarah rubbed her temples. This is more than just a hospital scandal. We have records of judges signing off on illegal adoptions. Lawyers covering up paperwork. Police officers ignoring missing child reports. Jennifer exhaled. And Dr. Harper is at the center of it all. Evelyn clenched her fists. The man who told me my son was dead. Sarah tapped a document. According to this, Harper didn't just falsify birth records, he also directed specific babies to wealthy clients. Evelyn's stomach churned. He wasn't just covering it up. He was selling them. Jennifer grabbed her phone. We need to make copies of everything and send it to multiple sources, the FBI, investigative journalists, advocacy groups. If we only go to law enforcement, there's a risk they'll bury it. Evelyn nodded. We exposed this in broad daylight. Sarah hesitated. Are we sure we're ready? If we go public, these people will fight back. They have power, money, connections. Evelyn looked at her son's photo, the one he had carried through every foster home. We don't have a choice. By morning, copies of the stolen files had been scanned and sent to trusted allies. Jennifer had contacted an investigative journalist named Mark Holloway, someone she knew wouldn't be afraid to publish the truth. Evelyn spent the morning preparing her statement. She was ready to go public. But by noon, something happened that made her blood run cold. A car pulled up in front of her house. A black SUV. Tinted windows. The engine idled. Evelyn stood by the window, her pulse quickening. Sarah appeared behind her. "You recognize it?" "No," Evelyn whispered. "But they aren't here by accident." The driver's side door opened. A man stepped out, dressed in a dark suit. He didn't approach the house. He just stood there, watching. A message. Jennifer's phone buzzed. She read the screen and swore. "Lena's gone." Evelyn turned. "What do you mean gone?" "She didn't show up for work. No one's seen her since last night." Evelyn's breath caught. "They know." She turned back to the window. The man in the suit was still there. A moment later, the SUV pulled away. Sarah's voice was grim. "They're warning us." Jennifer grabbed her keys. "Then we need to move faster." That night, Evelyn met with Mark Holloway, the journalist Jennifer had contacted. He sat across from them in a dimly lit cafe, flipping through the stolen records. His face darkened with every page. "This is huge," he whispered. "But you understand what you're stepping into, right?" Evelyn's jaw was tight. "I don't care. I want the world to know." Mark leaned forward. "This isn't just going to be an article. This is going to start a war. The people behind this, they're dangerous." Evelyn's voice was steady. "So am I." Mark studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. We go live tomorrow." Jennifer inhaled sharply. "Are we sure about this?" Evelyn thought about Daniel. About the years they had lost. About the hundreds of other children who were still missing, their mothers still grieving. She looked Mark dead in the eye. "We expose every single one of them." Mark nodded. "Then let's burn it all down." The next morning, the world changed. Headlines flashed across news stations. Elite baby trafficking ring exposed. Judge Carter reunited with stolen son. Decades of corruption uncovered in hospital scandal. The files had been leaked. The names, the evidence, it was everywhere. The public exploded with outrage. But so did the people behind the operation. Threats began rolling in. Officials started resigning. Hospitals released statements denying involvement. And then, Evelyn received a message. A single sentence typed in black on a white screen. "You should have stayed quiet." She stared at the words. Then, without hesitation, she deleted the message. Because she wasn't staying quiet. Not anymore. Evelyn barely had time to process the weight of what they had done before the consequences began. The media frenzy was like a storm, sweeping through every corner of the country. News stations played her story on repeat, her tearful reunion with Daniel, the stolen children, the deep corruption that had been hiding in plain sight. People were furious. The public demanded arrests, resignations, explanations. But the people behind this didn't rise to power by accident, and they wouldn't fall without a fight. She kept Daniel close. Jennifer had urged her to stay somewhere safe, but Evelyn refused to be driven into hiding. She had fought for too long to reclaim her son. She wouldn't let fear take him from her again. The police offered protection, but even they seemed nervous about the scope of the scandal. The officers stationed outside her home never spoke much, but their presence was a silent acknowledgement of the danger circling closer. Sarah called early that morning, her voice tense. "It's happening, Evelyn. They're scrambling. Dozens of officials have resigned overnight. 3 hospitals announced internal investigations. And," she hesitated, "there's a warrant out for Dr. Harper." Evelyn's stomach twisted. The man who had stolen her son, who had lied to her face, was finally being held accountable. But something felt off. "He won't go down quietly," she murmured. "He hasn't been seen in over 24 hours, Sarah confirmed. "The FBI is searching for him." Evelyn rubbed her temple, exhaustion pressing in on her. She hadn't slept in days, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the hospital room where they had told her Daniel was gone. That sterile white room, the nurse's pitiful look, the paperwork they had shoved in her hands. She had been too grief-stricken to ask questions then, but now she saw the truth. They had planned it all. Jennifer burst into the room, her face pale. "You need to see this." She held up her phone, a breaking news report flashing across the screen. The image was grainy, but it was unmistakable, Dr. Harper being escorted in handcuffs through a private airport. The headline read, "Lead doctor in trafficking case caught fleeing country." He was trying to board a plane to Argentina, Jennifer said, her voice shaking with adrenaline. He had fake passports, cash, he knew this was coming. Evelyn exhaled, feeling the first real relief in days. He didn't get away. No, Jennifer agreed. But he's not the only one. Evelyn looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Jennifer scrolled down. Several key figures in the adoption agency vanished overnight. Bank accounts are being drained. They're moving, Evelyn. They know their empire is collapsing. Evelyn's pulse quickened. We have to find them before they disappear completely. Sarah's voice came through the speaker. We don't just need arrests. We need the children. Some of them are still lost in the system. Some of them might not even know they were stolen. Evelyn swallowed. How do we find them? We follow the money, Jennifer said, determination hardening her expression. New Beginnings left a financial trail, and I know exactly where to look. That night, they met in a small office rented under Jennifer's name. It was safer that way, less traceable. Evelyn had insisted on coming despite Sarah's protests. She couldn't just sit back and wait. Not when there were more children out there, waiting for the truth. Jennifer pulled up a document on her laptop. The money from these illegal adoptions had to go somewhere. Offshore accounts, shell companies, payoffs, everything ties back to a network of fake businesses. She clicked through transaction logs, pointing out names that Evelyn recognized from the case files. Some of these payments were made after the adoptions, she explained. Which means someone is still controlling the money. Evelyn frowned. So someone at the top is still operating. Exactly, Jennifer said. And if we follow these accounts, we'll find them. Sarah leaned in, scanning the data. We should send this to the FBI. I already did, Jennifer admitted. But we need more than just evidence, we need a name. Evelyn stared at the numbers. Something nagged at her. There's something missing. Jennifer sighed. The problem is that a lot of these transactions are buried under fake identities. We don't know who's really behind them. Evelyn frowned. What about real estate? People like this don't just move money, they buy things. Property. Businesses. Jennifer's eyes lit up. That's a good angle. She pulled up another set of records, filtering through purchase histories connected to New Beginnings. Then she froze. Oh my God. Evelyn leaned over. What? Jennifer clicked on a file, revealing a list of luxury properties purchased under an alias. One of them was a sprawling estate in upstate New York, bought 5 years ago. The buyer's name is fake, Jennifer said. But the address, look at the address. Evelyn's breath caught. It was the same town where New Beginnings had once operated. Sarah's voice was tight. You think they moved the children there? Jennifer nodded slowly. It's possible. If I were trying to keep something hidden, I'd put it somewhere no one would think to look. Evelyn grabbed her coat. Then we go. Sarah gaped at her. Absolutely not. If we're right, these people are dangerous. We don't have time to wait, Evelyn shot back. What if there are children there right now? What if we lose them forever? Jennifer hesitated, then nodded. I'll drive. Sarah swore under her breath but followed them out the door. The drive was tense, the darkness stretching over the highway like a heavy curtain. Evelyn's hands were clenched in her lap, her mind racing. The estate was isolated, surrounded by forest. If there were children there, they would be completely cut off. Jennifer slowed as they approached the long driveway. There were no visible guards, but the place was massive, its high fences casting long shadows under the moonlight. This is reckless, Sarah whispered. Evelyn stepped out of the car, heart hammering. We can't turn back now. Jennifer turned off the headlights. We get in, we look, and we get out. They crept along the fence, searching for an opening. Evelyn's stomach churned as she spotted the security cameras mounted on the gate. Whoever was inside wasn't just trying to protect property, they were keeping something in. A dog barked in the distance. Lights flickered in the windows. Then, from somewhere inside the house, came a sound that made Evelyn's blood run cold. A child crying. She turned to the others, her voice barely a whisper. They're here. Sarah's face was pale. We need to call someone. Jennifer was already reaching for her phone. I'll call the FBI. Evelyn barely heard them. Her heart pounded as she stared at the estate. The children were here. And she wasn't leaving without them. Evelyn pressed herself against the fence, her pulse hammering as she listened to the distant sound of a child's cry. The house loomed in the darkness, its towering presence suffocating. Jennifer was already on the phone with the FBI, her voice low and urgent as she relayed their location. Sarah stood frozen, torn between fear and the undeniable fact that they had just uncovered something that could change everything. Evelyn's mind raced. If the children were here, they could be in danger. Were they locked away? Were they scared? She couldn't shake the thought of Daniel, alone, waiting for someone to save him. But no one had come for him, not for 8 long years. She wouldn't let that happen to these children. "We can't wait," she whispered. "What if they move them before the FBI gets here?" Jennifer shot her a sharp look, covering the phone's receiver. "We don't have a choice. We can't take this place on alone." Evelyn wasn't listening. Her eyes scanned the perimeter. A side door near the back of the estate stood slightly ajar. It could be an entrance, an opportunity. Sarah grabbed her arm. "Evelyn, don't." But it was too late. She moved swiftly, keeping low as she crept toward the door. Jennifer cursed under her breath, hurrying to follow while still speaking to the FBI. Sarah, gritting her teeth, brought up the rear. The estate was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of security cameras shifting on their mounts. The air smelled of damp earth and freshly cut grass. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she reached for the door handle, half expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway lined with expensive paintings. The floors were marble, cold beneath her feet even through her shoes. The house was massive, designed to intimidate. Every instinct screamed at her that this was more than just a hideout. This was a prison. Jennifer hung up the call. "FBI is on their way," she whispered. 15 minutes. Evelyn nodded. 15 minutes could be a lifetime. They moved quickly, their steps soundless on the polished floors. The house was eerily still, but Evelyn could sense movement beyond the walls. A distant creak. A hushed whisper. They weren't alone. A faint whimper stopped her in her tracks. She turned, following the sound. It led them to a door at the end of the hallway. Her hands shook as she reached for the knob, but before she could turn it, Jennifer grabbed her wrist. "We don't know what's behind there," she warned. Evelyn's gaze hardened. Children. She pushed the door open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. A single crib sat in the center, surrounded by plush toys and blankets. A tiny girl, no older than 2, sat inside, her chubby fingers gripping the wooden bars. Her dark eyes widened at the sight of them, tears streaking her round cheeks. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Sarah stepped forward, voice trembling. "Oh my God." Jennifer quickly scanned the room. "Where are the others?" she whispered. Evelyn reached for the little girl, gently lifting her into her arms. The child clung to her instantly, her tiny fingers grasping Evelyn's sweater with a desperate grip. Her little body trembled, and Evelyn fought the lump in her throat. "Sure, it's okay," she whispered. "We've got you now." A sound in the hallway made them freeze. Heavy footsteps. More than one. Jennifer pulled Sarah and Evelyn back toward the shadows, pressing them against the wall just as a man stepped into the doorway. He was tall, built like a bodyguard, dressed in all black. His sharp gaze swept the room before he pulled a phone from his pocket. "They're here," he muttered. "They found the kid." Evelyn's blood ran cold. Jennifer gripped her arm, whispering urgently, "We need to move. Now." Evelyn held the little girl close, shifting her weight to move without making a sound. The hallway outside was blocked, but there had to be another way out. Jennifer motioned toward another door, a side exit, hopefully. Sarah hesitated. "We should." A sudden shout rang out. "Hey!" The guard had spotted them. Jennifer shoved Evelyn forward. "Run!" They bolted down the corridor, Evelyn clutching the child as she forced herself to move faster. The estate was a maze of rooms and hallways, the lavish decor a cruel contrast to the horror hidden within its walls. Heavy footsteps pounded behind them, closing in. They burst into a larger room, an office. A massive oak desk sat in the center, papers scattered across its surface. But there was no time to look. Evelyn spotted a window. Jennifer yanked it open. "Go!" Evelyn hesitated only for a second before climbing out onto the narrow ledge. The little girl whimpered, but Evelyn tightened her grip, whispering soothing words. Jennifer was right behind her, helping Sarah through as shouts echoed from inside. Flashlights flickered in the distance. Then, a voice. "FBI! Hands up!" Relief crashed into Evelyn so hard she nearly collapsed. Agents swarmed the property, their weapons raised as they moved in. The guards tried to run, but they were outnumbered. Jennifer sagged against the wall. "We made it." Sarah let out a choked laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. Evelyn looked down at the little girl in her arms. She was still clinging to her, big brown eyes filled with exhaustion and fear. Evelyn's voice was soft but firm. "You're safe now." A female agent approached, her sharp eyes scanning them. "Are you okay?" Evelyn nodded. "There are more children." "We know," the agent confirmed. "We're securing the property now." Jennifer exhaled, running a hand through her hair. This place was never just a hideout. Sarah shuddered. It was a processing center. Evelyn's grip tightened around the child. How many more had come through here? How many had already been taken away? The agent turned toward the house, her radio crackling. "We have multiple children located. Some are in hidden rooms. We're bringing them out now." Evelyn's knees nearly buckled. "They found them." Sarah wiped at her eyes. "This is it, isn't it? The beginning of the end for them." Jennifer nodded, watching as more agents flooded the estate, leading children out into the night. Evelyn pressed a gentle kiss to the little girl's forehead, her heart swelling with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. Hope. They had won this battle. But the war was far from over. Evelyn stood outside the estate, watching as FBI agents carried children out of the dark corridors they had been trapped in for so long. The little girl in her arms had finally stopped trembling, exhaustion winning over her fear as she dozed off against Evelyn's shoulder. Around her, the scene was controlled chaos, agents barking orders, medical personnel rushing in, forensic teams documenting every inch of the property. Jennifer stood beside her, arms crossed, eyes scanning every face that emerged from the building. "We did it," she murmured, but her voice lacked the triumph the words should have carried. Evelyn knew why. The sight of so many terrified children being carried out, silent, confused, broken, wasn't a victory. It was proof of just how much damage had already been done. Sarah approached them, her face pale. 17, she said softly. "That's how many they've found so far." Evelyn's breath hitched. 17 children. Stolen, trafficked, locked away in an estate meant to hide them from the world. "How many more?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the raid. Sarah shook her head. "We don't know yet. Some of them are too young to even tell us their real names." A wave of nausea rolled through Evelyn. Some of these children might never be identified. Stolen so young that they had no memories of their real families, no names, no history, just ghosts trapped in a nightmare they hadn't asked to be part of. Jennifer exhaled sharply. "They'll find them. The FBI is running DNA tests, matching records. Every child here has a family looking for them." Evelyn wanted to believe that. She needed to believe that. But she had seen the system fail before. She had seen reports get buried, cases go cold. She had watched Daniel suffer in a system that was supposed to protect him. She looked down at the sleeping girl in her arms. How long had she been trapped here? How many nights had she cried herself to sleep, wondering where her mother was? An agent approached them, his expression grim. "We need to talk." Jennifer straightened. "What is it?" The agent hesitated. "We found records inside. Lists of names, financial transactions. This isn't just one estate. This is bigger than we thought." Evelyn's heart pounded. She knew it. She had felt it from the beginning. This wasn't an isolated case. This was part of something massive, something deeply rooted, something that wouldn't be taken down with a single raid. Sarah inhaled sharply. "How many locations?" The agent looked between them, as if weighing whether they were ready for the answer. Then, quietly, he said, "At least 12. Jennifer stiffened. 12. 12 confirmed properties, the agent corrected. But there could be more. The files we found indicate an entire network, operating under multiple fronts, adoption agencies, foster homes, even private hospitals. Evelyn's stomach churned. And the children? How many? The agent's jaw tightened. Hundreds. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn clutched the child in her arms a little tighter. Hundreds. This wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It wasn't just about the children in this house. It was about every stolen child who had been erased from the world, every mother who had been told their baby was dead, every desperate couple who had unknowingly raised a child that wasn't theirs. Jennifer's voice was razor-sharp. We need to take them all down. Every single one of them. The agent nodded. That's the plan. The FBI is coordinating with law enforcement across multiple states. We're moving in the next 24 hours. Sarah swallowed hard. We have to be ready. Evelyn glanced toward the estate one last time, watching as another child, a boy, no older than 5, was led out by a female agent. He looked around, confused, scared, his small hands clenching at the fabric of his oversized shirt. She had spent so long searching for Daniel. And now, standing in the middle of a battlefield filled with stolen children, she realized this fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next 24 hours were a blur of movement. Evelyn barely had time to process what was happening before they were on the road again, following the FBI to a secure facility where the rescued children were being processed. They would undergo medical examinations, interviews with child psychologists, and DNA testing. It was the first step in reuniting them with their real families. The little girl in her arms had been taken to a medical unit, where doctors assured Evelyn she was physically unharmed. But the psychological scars, those were something else. She had refused to let go of Evelyn's hand. Sarah had smiled gently. I think she's chosen you. Evelyn had spent the rest of the night sitting by the child's side, stroking her soft curls, humming lullabies that weren't hers to sing but felt necessary in the silence. Jennifer had come in around dawn, dropping into the chair beside her. You should sleep. Evelyn shook her head. I can't. Jennifer sighed. I know. They sat in silence for a moment before Jennifer finally spoke. The FBI has already started the next phase. They're raiding 2 more properties today. More kids. More arrests. Evelyn closed her eyes. It never ends, does it? Jennifer hesitated. Maybe that's a good thing. Evelyn frowned. How? Jennifer's expression was tired, but determined. Because it means we're not done fighting. It means we're still looking, still exposing, still saving them. Evelyn exhaled slowly. She had spent 8 years searching for her son. And now, it seemed, she had stumbled into a war she wasn't prepared for. But she wasn't leaving. She wasn't backing down. The child beside her stirred, her tiny fingers reaching for Evelyn's. She squeezed back, offering silent reassurance. Jennifer smiled knowingly. You're not walking away from this, are you? Evelyn shook her head. No. Jennifer nodded. Good. Because we need you. Outside the window, the sky had started to lighten, a soft pink hue breaking through the darkness. For the first time in a long time, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope. But hope wasn't enough. They still had work to do. Evelyn sat at the edge of the hospital cot, watching as the little girl slept. The night had been restless for her, filled with tossing and quiet whimpers, but now, in the soft glow of the early morning light, she seemed more at peace. Evelyn brushed a loose curl from her forehead, the weight of everything settling heavily in her chest. It had been less than 2 days since the estate raid, yet the world had already changed entirely. The news of the child trafficking network had exploded across every major news outlet, and with the FBI coordinating across multiple states, the entire operation was being dismantled piece by piece. Every hour brought updates, more children found, more arrests made, more families coming forward to claim their missing sons and daughters. But with each win came more painful truths. Not every child had a name. Not every child had a family waiting for them. Some had been too young when taken, others had birth records erased so thoroughly that there was no easy way to trace their origins. Evelyn rubbed her temples. The enormity of it all felt suffocating. She turned when Jennifer entered the room, coffee in hand. You look like hell, Jennifer said, handing her the cup. Evelyn accepted it with a tired smile. I feel like it. Jennifer exhaled as she took a seat. The FBI is moving in on another location today. Bigger than the last. They think there could be at least 30 kids there. Evelyn clenched her jaw. 30. The numbers kept growing, and no matter how many children were rescued, it felt like the problem stretched far beyond their reach. They're bringing in federal prosecutors, Jennifer continued. They're fast-tracking indictments, hitting every corrupt official, every doctor, every judge who had a hand in this. Evelyn shook her head. It should never have come to this. How did it get this bad? How did so many people turn a blind eye? Jennifer looked at her, her expression unreadable. You already know the answer to that. Money. Power. Corruption. It was always the same story. Those at the top protected themselves while those at the bottom suffered in silence. The little girl stirred, curling into the blanket Evelyn had draped over her. She hadn't spoken a word since they found her. The doctors had said it could take weeks, maybe longer, before she felt safe enough to use her voice again. Evelyn reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "Do we know her name yet?" Jennifer shook her head. "The records are still being processed. We'll run a DNA test, but that could take time." Evelyn sighed. "She deserves to know who she is. She deserves a hell of a lot more than that." Evelyn knew Jennifer was right. Every one of these children deserved justice. They deserved love, safety, and a chance to heal. But justice moved slow, and healing was even slower. The door opened again, and Sarah stepped in, a file tucked under her arm. "We found something." Jennifer straightened. "What?" Sarah flipped open the file, revealing a photograph. "Her name is Lillian. She was taken 4 years ago." Evelyn's breath caught as she looked at the picture. It was her. The same dark curls, the same round cheeks, but in the photo, she was smiling, a real, full smile. A smile that had been stolen from her. "Her mother's name is Olivia Grant," Sarah continued. "She's been looking for her since the day she disappeared." Evelyn swallowed hard. "Where is she?" "She's on a flight now," Sarah said. "She should be here by tonight." Evelyn turned back to Lillian, still sleeping peacefully. How would she react when she saw her mother? Would she remember her? Would she run to her arms, or would the fear of the past few years keep her from trusting again? Jennifer was already pulling out her phone. "I'll make sure we have security ready when she gets here. This case is too high profile. The press is going to be all over it." Evelyn barely heard her. She was too focused on the little girl in front of her, the one who had clung to her like a lifeline for the past 2 days. Would she have to say goodbye? She pushed the thought away. "This isn't about you." This was about Lillian. About getting her back to her family. About giving her a chance to heal. Hours passed in a blur of briefings and phone calls. The FBI continued making arrests, each new revelation exposing more of the horrifying scale of the operation. Hospitals were involved. Private adoption agencies. Wealthy families who had paid to bypass the legal system. It was a tangled mess of greed and desperation, and the deeper they dug, the worse it became. As night fell, Evelyn stood in the hospital's waiting room, her pulse hammering as she watched the doors. Then, she saw her. Olivia Grant rushed through the entrance, eyes wide, scanning the room desperately. She looked so much like her daughter, same dark curls, same expressive eyes filled with emotion too big to contain. Evelyn stepped forward. "Mrs. Grant?" Olivia turned sharply at the sound of her name, eyes locking onto Evelyn. "Where is she? Where's my baby?" Evelyn's throat tightened. "She's here. She's safe." Tears welled in Olivia's eyes. "Can I see her?" Evelyn nodded and led her down the hall. When they entered the hospital room, Lillian was sitting up in bed, eyes wary, fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. Olivia gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth as sobs racked her body. "Lily?" Lillian flinched slightly at the sound, her eyes darting between Evelyn and the stranger before her. Evelyn knelt beside her, keeping her voice soft. "Lillian, sweetheart, this is your mom." Lillian didn't move. She just stared, her small body tense. Olivia took a slow step forward, her voice thick with emotion. "Baby, it's me. It's Mama." Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Lillian slid off the bed, her steps hesitant. Olivia knelt, holding her arms open, waiting. For a moment, Evelyn thought she might not go. That the trauma had stolen too much from her. But then, with a soft, choked sob, Lillian threw herself into her mother's arms. Olivia broke completely, clutching her daughter as she wept into her curls. "Oh my God. Oh my God. I missed you so much." Lillian buried her face against her mother's shoulder, clinging to her like she never wanted to let go. Evelyn felt her own eyes sting as she quietly stepped back, giving them their moment. Jennifer exhaled beside her. "Well, if anyone ever doubted miracles, there's one right there." Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat. Yeah, Lillian had found her way home. And now, they had to fight to make sure every stolen child got the same chance. Evelyn sat in the corner of the hospital room, watching the reunion unfold with quiet reverence. Lillian clung to her mother, her small body shaking with the force of her emotions. Olivia rocked her gently, whispering reassurances, tears slipping down her cheeks. The moment was so raw, so full of everything stolen and everything found, that Evelyn felt like an intruder just being there. She glanced toward Jennifer, who stood near the door, arms crossed, her face unreadable. But Evelyn knew her well enough to see through the mask. Jennifer was barely holding herself together. "You okay?" Evelyn murmured. Jennifer exhaled, shaking her head. "I should be asking you that." Evelyn turned back to Olivia and Lillian. She didn't know how to feel. Relief? Yes. Gratitude? Of course. But beneath all of that was something else, something sharp and aching. She had spent the last 2 days taking care of Lillian, keeping her safe, holding her through nightmares. She had been the one the little girl had clung to when she was too scared to sleep. And now, she was watching her let go, finding comfort in the arms of the woman who had been searching for her all these years. It was how things were supposed to be. But it still hurt. "She'll be okay," Jennifer said, as if sensing Evelyn's thoughts. Evelyn nodded. "I know." And she did. But knowing didn't make it easier. After what felt like an eternity, Olivia finally pulled back just enough to press kisses against her daughter's forehead. "I was so afraid I'd never see you again," she whispered. "I prayed every day, baby. Every single day." Lillian's voice was barely a whisper. I thought you didn't want me anymore." Olivia gasped, clutching her tighter. "No, sweetheart, never. I never stopped looking for you." Lillian hesitated, her small fingers curling into her mother's jacket. They told me you weren't coming." Evelyn closed her eyes. How many children had been told the same lie? How many had given up hope because they were convinced they were forgotten? "Well, they were wrong," Olivia said fiercely, her voice thick with emotion. "Because I love you. I never stopped loving you." Lillian made a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp and buried herself against Olivia's chest again. Jennifer shifted beside Evelyn. "The FBI is going to need a statement from Olivia before she leaves." Evelyn nodded. "Let them wait." Jennifer sighed. "Yeah. For now, nothing else mattered but the mother and daughter holding onto each other like they'd never let go again." 2 hours later, Evelyn found herself sitting in the hospital's small lounge, staring at a cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking. The events of the past few days weighed on her, exhaustion settling deep into her bones. The door opened, and Sarah walked in, files tucked under her arm. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "We have more names." Evelyn blinked, trying to push past her fatigue. "How many?" 17. Sarah set the files on the table. All of them match missing children cases from the past 10 years. Evelyn reached for the first file, flipping it open. A photograph of a toddler stared back at her, big brown eyes wide with innocence. She swallowed hard. 17 more children. 17 more families who had lived in the same agony Olivia Grant had endured. And those were just the ones they had identified. Jennifer walked in a moment later, reading from her phone. Another raid happened in Denver this morning. They found 14 kids. Evelyn let out a slow breath. "God." Sarah sat down, rubbing her temples. "This is bigger than any of us thought." Jennifer nodded. "And it's nowhere near over." Silence fell between them. Evelyn looked at the files again. These were real children. Real lives. Some had families still searching for them, desperate for answers. Others might have no one left at all. "We keep going," she said finally, her voice steady. "Until every single one of them is found." Jennifer and Sarah nodded. No hesitation. This wasn't just about Lillian anymore. It never had been. Later that night, Evelyn found herself standing outside the hospital, the cold air biting at her skin. She needed a moment to breathe, to process everything. Behind her, the door opened, and she heard the sound of hesitant footsteps. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. "You okay?" Olivia asked softly. Evelyn let out a quiet laugh. "Funny. That's the second time someone's asked me that today." Olivia stepped beside her. "I'm not going to say thank you." Evelyn looked at her, brows furrowing. "You don't have to." "No, I mean it," Olivia said, her voice thick with emotion. "Because there aren't words for what you did for my daughter. For me." Evelyn swallowed hard. You kept her safe," Olivia interrupted, her eyes shining with gratitude. "You held her when I couldn't. You gave her hope when she didn't have any left. Evelyn looked away. She didn't know how to respond to that. After a moment, Olivia took a slow breath. She's going to need time to heal. We both are. But if you ever want to see her again. Evelyn turned back to her, surprised. I'd like that, Olivia finished softly. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. Yeah, she said. I'd like that too. They stood there for a long moment, neither saying anything. Then Olivia smiled, a small, tired thing. Get some rest, Evelyn. Evelyn nodded. You too. She watched as Olivia walked back inside, the weight in her chest easing just a little. Maybe this wasn't goodbye after all. Evelyn barely had time to sit down before the next crisis arrived. Sarah rushed into the small conference room at the FBI field office, files clutched to her chest, her face tight with urgency. Jennifer was already seated across from Evelyn, scrolling through her phone with an unreadable expression. We have a problem, Sarah said, slamming the files onto the table. A big one. Evelyn rubbed her temples, exhaustion pressing against her skull like a vice. Define big. Sarah took a breath. One of the suspects, Arthur Langston, just made bail. Evelyn's stomach dropped. What? He's out, Jennifer confirmed without looking up from her phone. Some judge approved it late last night. No restrictions. No house arrest. He walked out a free man. Evelyn sat back, her blood turning to ice. Langston was one of the key figures in the trafficking ring, a man who had worked in the shadows for years, orchestrating abductions and falsifying records. They had enough evidence to put him away for life, but somehow, he had slipped through the cracks. How the hell did this happen? Evelyn demanded. Sarah shook her head. We don't know yet. But it reeks of corruption. Jennifer finally looked up. He's going to run. Evelyn's hands clenched into fists. Then we can't let him. Sarah nodded. The FBI is already tracking him. They have agents watching his house, but he hasn't gone back. He knows we're watching. Jennifer tossed her phone onto the table. And it gets worse. We found offshore accounts linked to him. Millions of dollars. If he disappears, we'll never find him again. Evelyn exhaled sharply. We have to move fast. We need an emergency injunction, Sarah said. Something to revoke his bail and get him back in custody. Jennifer tapped the files. We also need to figure out which judge signed off on this. If Langston has people on the inside, we need to shut them down before more of these bastards get out. Evelyn pushed back from the table. Then let's get to work. Hours later, Evelyn stood outside the courthouse, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles ached. Jennifer and Sarah were inside, working with the legal team to get Langston's bail revoked. The hearing was happening within the hour. But Evelyn wasn't thinking about the case. She was thinking about Lillian. Olivia had called earlier, her voice shaking with barely contained panic. Lillian had woken up screaming from another nightmare, inconsolable for nearly an hour. She's afraid they're going to take her again, Olivia had said. She keeps asking if they're still out there. Evelyn had promised her that Lillian was safe, but how could she be sure? Langston was walking free, and who knew how many others were waiting for their chance to escape justice? She let out a slow breath, willing herself to stay calm. Hey! She turned to find Jennifer standing next to her, hands in her coat pockets. Hearing's about to start. Evelyn nodded. Did we get the right judge? Jennifer's lips pressed into a thin line. Yeah. This one won't be bought. A small relief. As they walked back inside, Evelyn felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. They were so close to exposing every last piece of this operation, but the fight wasn't over yet. And she wasn't sure if it ever would be. The hearing lasted less than 20 minutes. The prosecution presented the offshore accounts, the risk of flight, the overwhelming evidence of Langston's guilt. The judge wasted no time. Bail is revoked, he said, his gavel slamming down. The defendant is remanded into custody immediately. Relief swept through Evelyn as Langston was led away in handcuffs. He glared at her as he passed, his lips curling into something that almost looked like amusement. This isn't over, he muttered. Evelyn held his gaze, her expression cold. You're right? It's not. Because she wouldn't stop until every single person involved in this nightmare paid for what they had done. Evelyn barely made it to Olivia's house before exhaustion threatened to drag her under. Olivia opened the door, relief flashing in her eyes when she saw her. "She's in her room," she said quietly. "She asked for you." Evelyn's heart clenched. "I'll go see her." She made her way down the hall, stopping at Lillian's door. The little girl was curled up on her bed, clutching the stuffed bear Evelyn had given her. "Hey, kiddo," Evelyn said softly. Lillian looked up, her eyes red from crying. "They're still out there, aren't they?" Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed. "Some of them, yeah. But we're making sure they don't hurt anyone else." Lillian hesitated. "What if they come back?" "They won't," Evelyn said firmly. "You're safe here. Your mom is going to keep you safe. And so am I." Lillian studied her for a long moment. "You promise?" Evelyn reached over, gently tucking a strand of hair behind Lillian's ear. "I promise." Slowly, Lillian relaxed, her small body unwinding as she scooted closer. Evelyn sat with her until she finally drifted to sleep, her breathing evening out. When she finally left the room, Olivia was waiting for her. "She trusts you," Olivia said quietly. Evelyn nodded. "I trust her too." They stood in silence for a moment before Olivia spoke again. "What happens now?" Evelyn exhaled. "We keep fighting." Olivia gave her a small, tired smile. "Good. Because they both knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet." Evelyn barely had time to process the victory of getting Langston back in custody before the next wave of chaos hit. The news spread fast, and with it came a series of threats, intimidation tactics, and legal maneuvers from the remaining members of the trafficking ring still trying to claw their way out of the system. Every day brought a new challenge, another corrupt official exposed, another lawyer trying to discredit their evidence, another attempt to delay the inevitable. But the tide had turned. By the time the final trial dates were set, the FBI had gathered irrefutable proof of the extent of the operation. Dozens of high-profile figures had been implicated, including judges, hospital executives, and wealthy families who had knowingly purchased stolen children. The weight of the evidence was staggering. No one was walking away from this. Evelyn sat at her desk, staring at the mountain of case files in front of her. She had spent months preparing, working with Sarah, Jennifer, and the FBI to make sure nothing slipped through the cracks. But the hardest part was knowing that for every child they had rescued, there were still others they might never find. Her phone buzzed. A message from Olivia, "She's asleep. Finally had a good day today. No nightmares." A small breath of relief passed through Evelyn's lips. Lillian was healing. Slowly, but surely. That was what mattered most. The trials began the next week. The courthouse was swarmed with media, protesters, and families desperate for justice. Evelyn sat in the front row, her hands clenched in her lap, as the prosecution laid out the full horror of what had happened. Every falsified death certificate. Every stolen baby. Every family torn apart. Langston sat at the defense table, expression unreadable, but the arrogance was gone. The people who had protected him, who had kept him safe, were either behind bars or scrambling to save themselves. He had nowhere left to run. One by one, the testimonies unfolded. Survivors. Mothers who had been lied to. Children who had grown up believing they had been abandoned. And then it was Evelyn's turn. She took the stand, steady and unflinching, as she recounted the case, the evidence, the countless lives that had been shattered. But the moment that hit hardest came when she spoke about Lillian. She remembered everything, Evelyn said, her voice strong. Not just in words, but in the way she held on to that fear. The way she would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, convinced someone was going to take her away again. These people, she looked directly at Langston, they didn't just steal children. They stole security, trust, a sense of safety that should have been every child's right. The courtroom was silent. Langston didn't meet her eyes. The verdict came a week later. Guilty. On every charge. It was over. Or at least, this part was. Evelyn stood outside the courthouse, breathing in the crisp air as the weight of the past year settled onto her shoulders. The fight wasn't over, not really. There would always be more work to do, more families to help, more battles to fight. But for now, justice had been served. Her phone rang. "Olivia. Come over," she said, her voice warm. "We're making cookies." Evelyn smiled. "On my way." When she arrived, the house was filled with laughter. Lillian ran up to her, flour dusted on her nose, and threw her arms around her waist. "We won," she said. Evelyn crouched down to meet her eyes. Yeah, we did. Lillian's smile was small but real. Can we make the bad dreams go away now? Evelyn brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. They'll go away on their own. But if they don't, I'll be right here. Always. Lillian nodded, satisfied, and ran back to the kitchen. Olivia watched them from across the room, her expression soft. She's getting better, Olivia said. So are you. They sat together as the evening stretched on, talking, laughing, finding small moments of normalcy after so much chaos. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they had finally found peace.